and welcome to this lecture which provides a broad conceptual overview of the spine. More specifically, this lecture will describe the general curvatures of the vertebral column, then provide a broad overview of its component parts including the vertebrae, the joints of the vertebral column, the vertebral canal, and the intrinsic muscles of the spine. But keep in mind the intent of this lecture is to provide a broad introduction to the spine, and each of these component parts will be described in more detail in subsequent lectures. So let's get started. The spine, which is also called the vertebral column, is located on the posterior side of the body in the midline and runs from the head to the pelvis. In humans, the vertebral column has evolved to allow for standing upright and for walking on two legs. As such, the vertebral column must be capable of a number of functions, including support for body weight, support for the thorax, transmission of forces, flexibility for movements, positioning and support for the head and upper limbs, and protection for the nervous system. When viewed from the side, the articulated adult vertebral column has four curvatures, which occur in the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. The thoracic and sacral regions form a kyphosis, which is a concave-shaped curve on its anterior aspect. The cervical and lumbar regions form a lordosis, which is a concave-shaped curve on its posterior aspect. The thoracic and sacral kyphosis are considered primary curves because the entire spine is kyphotic at birth, whereas the cervical and lumbar lordosis are considered secondary or acquired curves because they are not present at birth. The cervical lordosis only appears once the child gains head control and can start looking upwards. The cervical lordosis is essential to be able to stand or sit upright and move the head around in various directions. The lumbar lordosis appears once the child starts to stand upright and walk around. The lumbar lordosis is essential to keep the center of gravity behind the hip joints during erect standing or walking. This is essential for hip extension and to maintaining an upright posture. So that briefly describes the functions and curvatures of the vertebral column. Now let's describe the vertebrae. The vertebral column itself consists of a series of 33 vertebrae which are held together by intervertebral discs, ligaments, and muscles. 24 of these vertebrae are separate bones while the remaining 9 are fused together. The separate vertebrae are mobile and consist of 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. The 9 fused vertebrae consists of 5 sacral vertebrae which are fused together to form the wedge-shaped sacrum, and 4 coccygeal vertebrae which are fused together to form the coccyx. A typical vertebrae consists of an anterior weight-bearing portion called the vertebral body and a posterior portion called the vertebral arch. The vertebral arch is formed by the pedicles and lamina, which together with the vertebral body forms a bony opening called the vertebral foramen. Projecting out from the vertebral arch are a number of processes which include the superior and inferior articular processes which form the zygoapophyseal joints, and the transverse and spinous processes which provide attachments for ligaments and muscles. The upper 2 cervical vertebrae, called the atlas and axis, are highly specialized vertebrae that have an atypical structure. And finally, the sacrum and coccyx bones are both triangular-shaped bones located at the inferior end of the vertebral column. When the vertebrae are articulated together, the vertebral foramen of each successive vertebrae form a continuous bony tunnel running along the length of the vertebral column called the vertebral canal. The vertebral canal contains the spinal cord, the cauda equina, and the spinal meninges. The vertebrae in the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions are connected by 2 types of joints. One which connects adjacent vertebral bodies called the intervertebral joints, and a pair of synovial joints which connects adjacent vertebral arches called the zygoapophyseal joints. The intervertebral joints are formed by the intervertebral disc which connects the vertebral bodies. The intervertebral disc contains 2 layers, an outer annulus fibrosus and an inner nucleus pulposus. These joints are designed for weight bearing, shock absorption, and strength. All the vertebrae in the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions are joined by an intervertebral disc starting at the joint between C2 and C3. The atlanto-occipital and the atlanto-axial joints do not have an intervertebral disc. The second type of joints are the pair of small synovial joints between the vertebral arches called the zygapophyseal joints. The zygapophyseal joints are classified as synovial plane joints and allow gliding movements of adjacent vertebrae. Movements between individual vertebrae take place at the intervertebral and zygapophyseal joints, and both joints move together as a functional unit. The amount of movement between individual vertebrae is small, but when added over successive vertebrae, the cumulative amount of movement becomes more considerable. Movements of the vertebral column include flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation. The amount of movement in each region of the spine does, however, vary. The cervical spine permits movement in all directions. The thoracic spine moves in all directions but is more limited than the cervical spine, while the lumbar spine allows considerable flexion and extension but less lateral flexion and rotation. The cervical spine also contains two specialized joints called the craniovertebral joints. These are the atlanto-occipital joint, which connects the occiput of the head with the atlas, and immediately below is the atlanto-axial joint, which joins the atlas with the axis. The primary movements of the atlanto-axial joints are flexion and extension of the head on the neck. Movement of the joints produces the characteristic head nodding movement when indicating yes to something. The primary movements of the atlanto-axial joints are head rotation on the neck. Movement of the joints produces the characteristic head shaking movement when indicating no to something. The thoracic region also has additional articulations that join the ribs with the thoracic vertebra called the costovertebral articulations. So that describes the vertebrae and joints of the vertebral column. Next, we'll move on to briefly describe the muscles of the vertebral column. The muscles of the vertebral column run up and down the posterior aspect of the vertebral column and are arranged into three layers. The superficial layer consists of the splenius cervicis and capitis muscles. The intermediate layer consists of the erector spinae muscles, while the deep group consists of the transversospinalis muscles. The superficial splenius muscles are thick muscles that lie on the posterior aspect of the neck, immediately below the trapezius muscle. These muscles help to extend or rotate the head and neck. The intermediate layer of erector spinae muscles are made up of three columns of muscles consisting of the iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinal muscles. These are multi-segmental muscles, meaning their fibers cross several spinal segments and run from the common tendon below to attach into various points along the spine and up to the back of the skull above. The erector spinae are the great extensors of the spine and straighten the spine from a flexed position or control forward flexion of the spine. The deep transversospinalis group consists of semispinalis, multifidus, and rotatories. These muscles are short and only span 2 to 4 spinal segments from the transverse process below to the spinous processes above. The transversospinalis muscles only produce localized movements and help to extend or rotate the spine. But they may also have a role in helping to stiffen or brace the spine during movement or loading. So that describes the muscles of the vertebral column. Finally, let's look at the contents of the vertebral canal. The vertebral canal contains the spinal cord, the spinal nerve rootlets, the spinal nerve roots, the spinal nerves, the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal cord is the main pathway between the peripheral nervous system and occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral column. The spinal cord runs from the base of the skull to terminate at the conus medullaris about the level of L1 or L2. Below the conus medullaris, the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves descend as the cauda equina. As it descends, the spinal cord gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves which exit each side of the vertebral column through their corresponding intervertebral foramen. There are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. These spinal nerves become part of the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord and the nerve roots are covered in 3 layers of meninges called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. These membranous layers surround, protect, and support the spinal cord, the nerve roots, the cauda equina, and the spinal nerves. So this now brings us to the end of this conceptual overview of the vertebral column. Keep in mind that some of the component parts will be described in more detail in subsequent lectures. So for now, thanks for listening.